actually coming at this from a slightly different angle. The work we do at Civic Pass, and I don't know if Ben Stokes is still in the room. Yes, we owe the name Civic Pass to him, so we always have to give credit to where that came from. The work that I do at Civic Pass is really entering from the point of participation. What does participation look like in the digital age? How do we need to rethink civic engagement in the context of participatory practices that we see that are not necessarily new, but are now able to be taken to a scale that we would not have thought of previously? So it's a slightly different angle than what we've seen here, and so it's actually quite perfect that it's the last piece to come in today. For the work that I'll be just referencing today, we were actually entering from the perspective of what the Youth and Participatory Politics Network, funded by MacArthur, has defined as participatory politics. Lots of participation in that sentence. They define participatory politics as peer-based participatory acts that seek to exert and affect change through practices like circulating media, encouraging dialogue online, producing media, and mobilizing towards social change. Now, at Civic Pass, we really draw on Henry Jenkins's previous work to look at it through the cultural lens, to really say, okay, so what is the connection between practices like that, between posting a meme on Twitter, and practices that are growing out of cultural spaces that have existed for a long time? And Henry's work in particular is rooted in understanding fandom. The work we did over the past 7 years was actually taking an in-depth look at 5 case studies of youth groups that we felt were really bridging this difference very effectively. So we went in and we wanted to really understand what they did. We interviewed them, we spent time with them, we analyzed their media. We actually ended up working with some of them on projects coming out of that. And just to give you a sense of the range of the organizations and networks that we looked at, I think Katie alluded to Invisible Children being one of them. We also looked at American Muslim networks. We looked at the Harry Potter Alliance and the related group called Nerd Fighters. We looked at youth that were mobilizing for the passing of the DREAM Act around 2009. And we looked at youth who identify with libertarian ideologies and were part of what they called the second wave of libertarianism. Now, certainly these groups have individual findings that are relevant to those communities, right? So for American Muslim youth, there were really concerns around specific kinds of surveillance and privacy concerns in the community and in relationship to forces like the FBI showing up at their houses post 9/11. But there were also really through lines that were striking considering how diverse these communities were. And what I want to do is just really briefly, before I invite out the panelists out here, I just want to highlight a few of these through lines that we were really struck by as we were analyzing data. One was around stories and storytelling, which is perfect, which I think is why I'm here today. What we found was that all of these groups used storytelling, and stories in plural intentionally, not only to tell their story, but also to organize, to find their community, to network with each other, and that actually stories were at the core of their activism. Well, another key finding related to this is that they were finding ways to tell stories and to mobilize through, as the book title reveals, any media necessary. And we use that intentionally to really counter the sort of wave of thinking that things are enabled by digital media and would not exist if you don't have access to that particular platform or so. What we found was that youth were incredibly innovative in thinking about what media to use given what they had access to. And not just in terms of what they knew how to use, but also understanding what their audiences were thinking, where their audiences were, and how they wanted them to interact. And then, in fact, the storytelling had to change significantly as they were working across these different media forms. This meant that they understood when to go broad, when to go spreadable, as Henry says, or when to go deep or drillable. So that kind of distinction was really crucial to their thinking about how they're going to use media. What we also found was that they were really successful most of the time, and sometimes failed, at thinking about a range of participation. So they understood that what has been called derogatively collectivism actually really matters. That click can actually be the first step to a range of different modes of participation, and that it's really crucial to offer these modes of participation to the people that they wanted to engage with over a period of time. And finally, kind of an umbrella finding was that the language of politics and civics was really different, and that that there was a real shift for the young people we observed around what language they wanted to use when they talked about civic issues, and that in fact politics had become a dirty word for them. They were like, we did a panel very early on at the Futures of Entertainment around 2009, 2010, and we selected these young activists, and they all got up there like, I don't do politics. And these were youth who were mobilizing around LGBTQ issues, around again, immigration issues, around American Muslim civil rights. And they were just like, I don't do politics. Politics is not what I do. So there's really been this shift to finding new language, and oftentimes it draws on popular culture. So the languages of superheroes, Superman being undocumented, was a really key frame when we were looking at young people mobilizing for immigration, or American Muslim youth used X-Men as this idea that they all had these superpowers, but they're kind of undercover, and sometimes you have to find each other. It's actually hard to find each other. So we were cautiously optimistic around sort of the trends that we were seeing, and that's kind of the term where we came out. I was like, this is what our assessment of the situation is. That said, we don't take it for granted that participation happens or that it actually has the desired effect. And some of the pieces that I'd love to talk to the presenters here about are around how do you move from that sort of expressive moment of voice to influence? What is that translation moment? And what we found was that, in fact, there's a key need for what Netta Kligler-Vilenchik has called mobilizing structures. This idea that you actually need flexible structures in place that are going to help scaffold that expressive moment, that participatory storytelling moment. There's a real role for a lot of the projects that have been described here, kind of seeing that as a key translation. And then the other piece, which I think has not actually been discussed here as much, was the issue of conceding control. We did a webinar around storytelling with some of these young activists, and the question of control came up. So what do you do when your message is out there? Once you send your message out and you're asking people to participate, you know, Coney 2012 being the prime example, like, what do you do? And it was like, you have to prepare for that. And to what degree can you prepare for that? And what did it mean for invisible children that it was actually possible for them to prepare for what happened after they released Coney 2012? But could they have done more? Yes. In retrospect, that analysis was really important to them. So that sort of question of like, how do we think about control, or how do we think about our authorship in this context of participatory practice? So what I'd like to do is actually invite the panelists out. And thank you. And I'm going to have my phone, not because, you know, I want to hang out on Facebook, but I am actually supposed to keep time on it, so I'm going to be glancing at it periodically. All right. So what I thought I would ask you first, all of you work with projects that really have participation at the center or at the heart. And when we were in the dressing room, we were kind of starting to talk about, well, what does that actually mean? What does it mean to have people participate? And I was just wondering if maybe you could define participation coming from your work for each one of you. And we don't have to always go down the line. We can start that way.
Yeah, I think I can just speak for CAR and a lot of the work that we've done. You know, that was one example of, you know, the participation, you know, was the response where we kind of asked people like, how do you see yourself in this? You know, and we created that space to really give them information and then get them to respond. And we've done that in a couple different scenarios and collaboration that we've had. We've got a poetry collaboration called the Off Page Project, where we paired young poets with our stories. We have a project called Storyworks, where we do the same with playwrights and have them create works in response to the stories. So for me, the participation, I mean, I think it's really about, for us, like carving out those creative spaces so that people can digest, you know what I mean? Because a lot of times investigative reporting is, you know, you just hear about the problems and it's this big thing, and at the end of it, you're like, wow, that's depressing. Like, what do I do? And I think carving out the way for you to be more empowering, and so you can really articulate, like, what can you do? Like, what are the options available? What are the what are the actions for recourse here that can be done. So for us, it's about creativity and empowerment, with information and getting people to do something with it.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's what it's not is not just consuming a story. Like that's not participation, and I think sometimes we're so driven by like how many clicks did that article get that it's tempting to just like think that that's your end product is like a bunch of people saw what you made. And I agree with Cole. Like it's really about action and giving people a place to take action, whether it's sharing your story or even like I feel like with both your projects with Portia and Cole, like you're moving people into spaces that they may not have been, and that physical movement is also an action. So I feel like what's great about the media landscape is there's not one way to take action. Like sharing on Facebook is an action, but so is going and showing up to a rally. Having stories that allow for that kind of movement, that's participatory.
I think in every example where I've engaged with children, it might be different in different communities, but the bottom line is putting the instrument in their hands and letting them see their own power at making an image or telling the story of that image. The other thing is that after we came back from our trip to Jackson, Mississippi, the stories, sharing the stories and the impact that it had on them and creating forums for them to voluntarily show up to be the ones who are going to be interviewed or whatever, or interviewing others. But the other thing that impressed me with the children who came back were two of the youngest had cards made, and they with their teacher, and it said under it community activists. So to kind of see them evolve into those shoes of being a community activist and showing up with their shirts and ties. And I was looking at them saying, "Wow, so you're going to be the next alderman, I guess, or whoever, next mayor." So. Yeah.
Can I jump in on that too? Because what struck me too about both your projects was the empowering people to tell their own stories.
Mm-hmm.
And I think from a journalism side, we're always telling someone else's story. And I like flipping that model where the participation is actually giving people the tools
Mm-hmm.
to do that for themselves and the platform to help elevate it and build their own narratives out of it.
How do you think about the practice of curating? So making decisions about what gets put in, what doesn't get put in. How do you think about that in the context of such participatory projects?
I don't have an answer, but we think about it a lot.
Yeah, I'd love to hear how do you think about it. I don't need an answer. Like, how do you actually process that? And
Well,
can you talk about your process?
It's tricky because, you have publication bias, like just the decision of whose voices show up in something, that is an editorial process. And I think going back to some of the earlier themes, like you look for folks whose voices are not represented in the traditional coverage of a story. Or don't have access to a place or to a conversation. And I feel like there's something to looking at social justice to amplifying those voices, but there's also fact-checking and balance and bias. And those are just the things that I'm sure we could talk endlessly about. And I have more questions than answers, but those are just some of the things we think about.
I think it's also a part of the literacy of working with youth is teaching them how to read the image or how to discern for themselves when someone's voice is stronger, even in their making of something. If I'm working with a core group and they're the only one showing up to make it, then their stories are represented. So you have to point out what is not there. You have to always ask what is missing.
Yeah, I would say too, just kind of on that note, I think it's even teaching, there's so many sources of information out there now too. Like, curation is a part of it's just a part of your day-to-day news diet now. Like, you see a bunch of stuff in your Facebook feed or your Twitter feed, and especially for young people, that's just the norm. That curation takes on a new power in a way, and we do have an ability to curate, but then also, these platforms are being curated for us as well. So it's challenging what you read. I get questions about like, how do you verify your sources, and how do you, and that's something just to always question what you read, like do some other digging, and that's what we do as journalists, and trying to pass on that philosophy too, I think is really important.
Yeah, I'm asking because we always grapple with the distinction between interactivity, engagement, and participation, right? Are they related? Which ones are more limited? And I was wondering if you've ever thought about these three terms, or if you think about, how do you think about them in relation to each other in your work?
give you an example that how I think they can be parsed out differently. For a different project, we looked at lead levels in candy. That report, this was a couple of years ago, and for an interactive component, we built in an desktop app where there's like a big pile of candy, and you have 2 grocery carts, and you have to sort which ones you think have lead in them, which ones you don't, and then at the end, it prints out a receipt saying like, this is how much lead was in your cart. So that's interactive, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily participatory because it's not moving you into a new space. You're not sharing your own story. So it's a different level of storytelling, but I don't know if it would be appropriate to have like a comment stream of like, what do you think? Oh, this is candy. This is horrible. I'm not sure if that furthers the story, but they can be really different in the kind of storytelling that we're able to do now on these platforms.
Yeah. Any other thoughts around those three?
Well, I think about the interactive part also. When I first started working with children in Milwaukee, basically their ideas and their agenda was being shaped by community activists. And so we would follow them to the front lines, marching in front of a liquor store that was selling single cigarettes or alcohol to underage kids. And the kids were involved because we would send them into the stores. And this is before GoPro cameras or anything like that, or iPhones. But it was really interesting to do that, involve them, and to get them to understand why there were so many billboards in their communities that had liquor. We go to a neighboring community and it didn't, or liquor advertisements or cigarette advertisements. And so I always think about that as the example, because we really, through that process, saw their transformation of understanding how their community was marginalized or thought of, and they advocated to change that. So I think that, of course, it's being shaped by adult ideas, but because they're so much a part of the landscape, that it was something that they began to care about.
So I was really struck about, actually really happy to see the range of different media examples that we had. So we had paper, right? We had people on a bus, which could be almost performative and reenacting a historical right. And then you had an app that you developed. So how do you think about media choices when you're thinking about participation? I mean, I know some of you may work in specific media forms, but how did you think about those media choices when you're thinking about that?
I just from my perspective, I mean, every story that we tell, we like to work through this exercise of stakeholder mapping, right? Like, what are the different levels of stakeholders? And for the direct stakeholders, the people that are directly affected by whatever issue we're covering, what do they need to know? And what do they not already know? And then how do they get their information? Like, what's the best way to get the news to them in a way that they can use, right? And it's not about like, hey, come to my website and check out my story, because they might not know your organization, they might not know or trust you. So how can you, take the effort to actually go to them? We did a project where we looked at pesticide use on strawberry fields in California, and there's largely in Southern California. There's a particular community, Oxnard, which is about an hour and a half northwest of LA, and that's where we focused on a lot of our engagement. That's where a lot of strawberries are grown. And we did a lot of stuff there. And one of the coolest things that we did that I thought was like the direct way was we'd done a pre-survey to kind of gauge the base level of understanding about the issue. And to do that, we'd gotten, you can buy like addresses by zip code pretty easily. Not that expensive. So we had all these addresses and we had this database of pesticide applications. So I'm blessed at CAR that we have a data team they're all brilliant, and I had Mike Corey, who's one of our news apps developers, run all the addresses in Oxnard through the database of pesticide applications, and it came out with the 5,000 addresses of the people who were in the hot spots. Wow. So then we came up with a postcard that we then mailed to those 5,000 addresses with a link to our story and a mobile component where you could text in and find how many pounds of pesticides were applied near you. So that was just a way that we were thinking about, okay, who is most affected and how do we really get them that information most directly? And so we had to get a little creative with it and use different resources that way.
I was thinking about the engagement overall, and finding that teaching and engaging with youth has to be intuitive in what I've done. And over time, because technology changes so quickly, on that trip, I was very kind of anxious and nervous, like how could I engage them in using a Zoom microphone or the DSLR when they were in their phones all the time.
Right.
And maybe they might use it for 5 minutes and want to do something else. But I think that was my biggest kind of, I think always, every time I meet someone or meet a project or an opportunity to work with you, I try to find out what they're comfortable working with or how they would like to shape stories. So I kind of start with the story first, and then we kind of decide how the story should be told, or and especially in the post-production process. Early on, my university students used to actually edit everything with them sitting there, but we engage them later on. But I think it's important for them now because they're so technically savvy that they're teaching me things. They can upload something in a moment. And so it's really daunting to see, even after 2 years, some of these kids who have become, very expressive in the visual medium. They're taking photographs or they're telling their stories. So, yeah.
Teresa, did you want to add something?
Just I go back to something that you said, Cole, which is like go where the people are. And I feel like in media we can go where the people are. Like for what you're talking about, you are sending postcards to the people. They're going to see that you're going to where the people are. And in media, especially working with youth, I mean, they're native to different types of storytelling than we are, and that can change in half a generation. And as we produce media, there's part of like certain formats are conducive to certain stories, but like whether it's low tech or high tech, if you want the story to affect people, go to where they will consume it and they'll get it.
So this is, I guess, the final question of the final panel of the day. So I just thought, there was some desire for hope in the room, and we've really been looking at civic imagination and imagining for a better future in the work that we've been doing recently. So I kind of want to throw out a crazy question at you all and see how it goes. The year is 2060, way in the future. What would your ideal of media and participation look like?
Wow. Anybody would take that?
Any brilliant thoughts?
I'll start. I think a lot of like what I want to emphasize and what I think is really important is just local news. I want local media to be strong, to be responsive to community needs. I want news to think more about like what the information needs are of the public, to really think about the public interest and to serve that public interest. And not, we don't have to just follow the horse race coverage of a campaign, right? There are a lot of other issues that we could spend a lot more time covering that are more practical for most people. And I think, really working, especially at the local level, like there's just things like, how do I know like what my city council is going to meet on and whether or not those things are important and how they affect me? Like most communities don't have things like that. And like, I feel like that's a role that journalism can really play. And we just launched a new initiative called Reveal Labs today, actually, which is about building support and capacity for local investigative and community engagement as two key components of that process. So I would like to see in-depth journalism like really respond to communities, community need, and involve them in that process in a way that's that's engaging and empowering and informative.
I'm going to ask each one of you.
I guess I think that so many stories are complex, and sometimes in media we think we don't have time to tell the complex story, and I feel like the more that we have these tools and the more that we increase access for people so that everybody has access to telling and consuming stories, that we should be able to take deeper dives in this. That's what I'd like to see, is when you say, ooh, that story is complex, you get to dive in and you get to have access to everybody's story. And I feel like it's happening with citizen journalism, like the local aspect is such a key part of it. But I look at what the work that everybody's doing in this room and all the speakers, and I think like people say media and storytelling is dying. It's not dying, it's just changing and expanding. And that gives me hope that I don't know what will exist in 5 years, but it's gonna be awesome.
I think I look back and I think about what we wished for, So as I see these younger students using all this technology, it was really about immediacy. I call myself a refugee from the analog world because I remember what that was like when I saw somebody creating something in in video that I was working very hard to do in film. You know, the layers and all of the information and not having enough money. So for me, it was always about immediacy. How can we do this and see it and distribute it easily? And that's happening right now. I really love the interactive Carnegie Mellon project because, you know, to get people to envision or to reenact or to feel that empathy about something in their shared communities, you know, not to be distant. I think that that's really important. So the more that kind of technology is made available would be ideal.
Right. Well, with that, thank you so much.
Thank
Thank you. Yeah, thanks everybody.